Around the world, election ecosystems are in constant motion, shifting under the forces of countless influences, including the viral messages spread through social media. Social media platforms are only as accurate and truthful as the people who post to them. The level and quality of fact-checking varies from one platform to the next. That means that half-truths or flat-out fiction may appear as facts. People who are predisposed to believe the postings will perceive them as the truth. When deception and misinformation impact the infrastructure, operations, and processes integral to our democracy, our elections, we must call it out and correct it. MITRE Squint provides a fast, easy, and comprehensive way for election officials to combat the spread of misinformation on social media channels. When elections officials and designated MITRE Squint users see untrue or inaccurate postings about the elections process, you can report it with a single click, whether using a desktop or mobile device. MITRE Squint collects a screenshot and the coded information for aggregation and analysis. You'll get a secure message to verify that you sent the screenshot. The verification message includes a report that you can share with election peers or send to the social media channel asking that the misinformation be removed. What happens then? MITRE Squint analyzes and identifies patterns in social media that are misleading voters. Your report enables faster takedowns and helps restore integrity to the elections process. MITRE Squint is helping election officials like you defend the elections process from disinformation campaigns designed to undermine election legitimacy. Contact us to learn more about MITRE Squint and become a participant. squint@mitre.org.
Hello, Trumanites. Greetings from rich, diverse, and sunny Los Angeles. My name is Elian Farsan. I'm a first-generation Arab American, and I'm here to talk to you about the immigration crisis. Today, roughly 258 million people are international migrants around the world. That's 3.4% out of the 7.7 billion world population. 70.8 million of those migrants were forcibly displaced by war, violence, and climate change. Only a fraction of those, less than 30 million, are refugees. That's 0.38% of the world population. Yes, you heard it right. 0.38% of the global population is considered by xenophobes and, quite frankly, lightweights, a crisis. Let me be clear. What we are experiencing today is a crisis of morals, a crisis of consciousness, not a crisis of numbers, and certainly not a crisis that we don't have the means to solve. My fellow Trumanites, the next panel will talk about the pandemic as a pretext to end immigration. Indeed, more than 205,000 Americans have died of COVID-19, and President Trump's answers to questions about his administration's inadequate response center on closing the borders, as opposed to how his administration should have medically responded to this public health crisis. This xenophobic reaction is nothing new in the history of pandemics filled with outbursts of fear-mongering and anti-immigration hysteria. In the US, we've always used race as an organizing principle to define problems in the economy, in the culture, and problems in the political domain. When there's a pandemic or any kind of health crisis, our existing ideas about race naturally shape how we process and frame the situation. Let's take a moment to think about how immigration and race intersect with the coronavirus. When our ideas about race define who is safe, or who is contaminated, or who is most likely to carry or spread the disease, or which borders we should close, we allow a scapegoating, xenophobic administration to carry out its long-planned anti-immigrant agenda without much pushback. What is surprising is that in the 21st century, even when we have a better understanding of diseases and how to combat them, our reactions are still not based on science, but rather on our perceptions, which are still distorted by our biases. The more these racial biases influence our response to a threat like a virus, the worse the health outcomes for everyone. 205,000 COVID-19 deaths is an evident outcome of our racism, and it's time to do something about it. So no, we don't have an immigration problem in the United States. We have xenophobia and racism, and it's time to call things what they are. Only when we start looking at immigrants as part of our American social fabric can we look at immigration as a civil rights issue and make it part of our essential reform agenda. Let's lead with that, Trumanites.
Good afternoon and good morning. I'm Adam Hunter. I'm an executive director of Refugee Council USA and a proud Truman Fellow since 2008. I'll be moderating and guiding us through this next discussion. First off, I want to provide some thanks to Jenna Ben-Yehuda, Julia Burnell, and the entire team at Truman for making this conversation possible on such an important occasion at such consequential time. We have a really big task before us for this discussion on immigration and the pandemic. Some of the Trump administration's most expansive uses of executive power, in fact, have been in the immigration space. 4 years in, there's virtually no part of the immigration system left untouched by this action. Then came a global pandemic. Most countries enacted reasonable temporary border security measures and travel restrictions. But here in the US, the Trump administration did far more than just that. They've erected a parallel immigration restriction architecture that is poised to outlast the pandemic emergency. And because the challenges with the pandemic are ongoing, we haven't yet seen the full effect of all these changes of just the past few months. But they do have the potential to reshape not only our immigration system, but our entire country. And none of this was done with any act of Congress. To bring important perspective to this moment, I'm thrilled to be joined by three very distinguished colleagues and friends. First, I'd like to introduce now Karen Tumlin from Los Angeles, who is the founder of the Justice Action Center, an organization that combines impact litigation and storytelling. She's a nationally recognized litigator of immigration rights and has been part of the legal team that has brought several Supreme Court cases, including the recent DACA case before the Supreme Court. Previously, she was the legal director of the National Immigration Law Center, also in Los Angeles. Next, I'd like to welcome Ali Nurani, President and CEO of the National Immigration Forum here in Washington, D.C. The forum's a nonpartisan advocacy organization working with faith, law enforcement, and business leaders. He's a California native and son of Pakistani immigrants, a very frequent and thoughtful commentator on a range of immigration issues, and the host of a podcast I'd recommend, Only in America. Finally, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Marvin, Niraja, who's the president and CEO of Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Service, an organization that's been welcoming refugees for the past 8 years. Her own family escaped civil war, and she arrived to Maryland as a baby. In a prior iteration, she had practiced law, also worked in the private sector, and served several years in the Obama administration, first at the Department of State as a senior advisor to the Secretary of State, and then at the White House, where she was the policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama. Thank you all for joining us and for having this important panel. To give us a little sense of how we'll cover this discussion, I'm going to start with asking each of our panelists a broad introductory question so that we can really lay the important issues we want to unpack on the table. We're going to have then a bit of a moderated discussion amongst ourselves on the panel, and then we'll open the last 20 to 25 minutes to audience Q&A. You can see and start to submit your questions via the viewer, which is below the window. You should be able to find that on your screen. So to start, I'd like to ask Karen, with your legal and policy expertise, could you paint for us an illustration of both the breadth and the depth of the Trump administration's changes on immigration policies. And if you would also describe the rush of changes that we've seen just in the past couple of months with the pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam. It is a pleasure to be with all of you and to be on this important panel. I'm going to basically try to talk about the Trump administration immigration changes in 5 main categories. The last is what Adam just alluded to, which is how these changes went on warp speed when the pandemic came into force. But, really stepping back, I want to say that President Trump, of course, in his original run for president, campaigned on immigration. It was one of his flagship issues. And we saw massive changes to the immigration system starting on his 4th day in office. And those changes have kept on coming. So big picture, we're literally at over 100 presidential actions to change the immigration system of all sorts. But let's kind of rewind quickly to the major 5 categories. So first, most people remember day 4 in office, the president makes good on his promise to enact a Muslim ban. Absolutely breathtaking change, unprecedented in historical scope, and that was in fact his first major policy move. So what I have seen from the president's changes in his 4 years now in office is first, what I would categorize as presidential changes to immigration policy that create a larger class of undocumented immigrants. So here I'm talking about things like essentially taking away temporary status from individuals or attempting to and rendering them undocumented. The 2 biggest examples of this are obviously the attempt by the president to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program, that would have, if it had been allowed to take full effect, render 800,000 young people undocumented again. So that's one example. The second example is the presidential efforts to end temporary protected status for folks. So temporary protected status is something that's given on a country basis to individuals who are in the country undocumented, but because of either civil strife in their country, so think protracted civil war, or humanitarian disasters, we have given them temporary protection here. Again, just a couple weeks ago, we had a decision that would allow those large-scale removal of temporary protected status for many nationalities to take place over the next year if President Trump is reelected. So that's really category 1. But that really deals with individuals who are already in the country and taking away a temporary protection and rendering them undocumented. Category 2, I would say, deals with limiting the inflow of immigrants to the United States. And here I think it's really important to talk about 2 different categories. One, and I know that my colleague Chris will be talking about this later, is humanitarian immigration, right? So our refugee system, which has, and I'm really pleased that we're having this important discussion today on October 1st, which is the deadline for submitting our refugee numbers for the year. But President Trump has radically gutted our refugee system as we know it. It's a system where we've had, under President Obama, who was increasing these numbers to really take on our global share. We're seeing the lowest historical ever numbers for refugees that would come in. And I'm not going to talk too much about this because I am flanked by just absolute refugee experts, and I know you'll get to hear from them. But I do want to mark that as a change in what we do for our overall immigration system, right? A radical restriction of the United States' role in welcoming refugees. Secondly, and this is a piece that we have seen absolutely put on steroids once COVID hit, President Trump has made clear that he wants to radically reform the legal immigration system to the United States. He tried and failed to get his changes through Congress. We have, as most of you know, a legal immigration system to issue green cards really in three primary categories, right? Family-based immigration, employment-based immigration, and then humanitarian immigration, which includes refugees and other things. President Trump wants to replace that with a merit-based system that really would radically reduce our family-based system. Again, this is congressionally mandated. These weren't made up willy-nilly. And his proposal to change that through Congress didn't happen. What we have seen as after COVID is that the president has introduced the most sweeping immigration ban possible on family-based immigrants, diversity visa immigrants, and employment immigrants as well. And again, I would like to put my cards on the table. This is a lawsuit that my organizations and others have brought. The reason is we're talking about in 1 year alone that the president's immigration ban would block over 500,000 immigrants from coming in. And I want to give you just a couple of brief examples. First, family-based immigrants. So some of them, thankfully, are exempt from the president's order. But because of COVID, the president said, absolutely no parents of US citizens may come into the country. Now, the rationale for this change is, and it's a worthy rationale to consider, economic recovery. But by and large, parents of US citizens are not necessarily coming in to enter the labor market. They're often coming in to, for example, care for children of US citizens, so that they, as oftentimes essential workers and others, may be able to go back into the labor market fully in the times we're dealing with. Okay, so moving on. Category 3. President Trump has eliminated any type of prioritization on who we deport. And so the reason I want to really highlight this is this also changes the composition of who's in the country. So it's a ramping up of our deportation machinery. Under President Obama, there was a move that increased over his tenure in office to ensure that deportations were tied primarily to criminal convictions. That's something that was removed by this president, meaning that individuals who have been here for a long time, US citizen children, no criminal records, are now being deported in rapid numbers. That is changing the composition of our immigrant population in the US. The last change that I want to talk about before speaking briefly on COVID is the border. And here I really do mean, and I am the daughter of a Canadian immigrant, I'm talking about the US southern border, not the US northern border. So the president has, over the last several years, including before COVID, really radically changed our policies at the US-Mexico border with respect to asylum seekers. And I think most of you are familiar with this. The biggest change is a series of policy changes that prohibit asylum seekers from entering the country and seeking asylum. This has resulted in really dire conditions along the US-Mexico border, where we have camps of migrants who are being held, in tent cities essentially for many, many months as they await the ability to come in and present their asylum claim before an extremely limited immigration court tribunal. They are, and this is not an exaggeration by any means, there's incredible documentation done by our friends at Human Rights Watch. These migrants, unfortunately, are very much sitting ducks for rape, assault, abuse, violence, and death while they're awaiting proceedings. I always lead with that, but also being in this situation makes it nearly impossible for them to find legal representation. The sum result is that the asylum ability to seek asylum, even with a meritorious claim, has been radically reduced. And the last thing I want to talk about before turning it back to Adam is COVID. What has happened under COVID for immigration policy? Now, I want to be clear, all of our lives are touched by COVID, and there are sensible policies, screening at the border, temperature checks, quarantine even, that I and others would support. It is not what the president has done. He has instead used the pandemic as an excuse to do things like I discussed earlier, enacting a ban on immigration for over 500,000 individuals, not tied to a concern that they will spread the pandemic, but tied to his own ideological definition of who he thinks should belong and come in, and trying to eliminate the diversity visa program, which is something he's wanted to do for years and cannot get through Congress, and trying to eliminate certain categories of family-based immigrants. And so that's my issue with the COVID policies. If you have a COVID policy because it is going to keep us safer and help with containment of the pandemic, I am open-minded. If you have a policy where you're going to use a pandemic as an excuse to seek ideological changes to the immigration system, I'm not down with that. Adam, that's what I'd say by way of summary, and turn it back to you.
I'm not down with that. Message heard. Thank you, Karen, for painting that very broad overview. Ali, I wanted to turn to you. So much change in the immigration space, so many obvious impacts to immigrants, but also Americans. I'd love to hear you talk about what you think has shifted in the broader populace. And if you could weigh in a little bit too on what the impact might be if these changes Karen's talking about take place on our economy and even our society going forward.
Great. Well, I mean, first of all, I really want to the Truman Project. I want to thank Adam for pulling together this panel, and I really want to thank my colleagues on the panel, Krish and Karen. Both of them are running and leading two of the most important organizations in the country, both in terms of the litigation fight that goes on and on and on and on, but also the resettlement of refugees and the advocacy for immigrants and refugees that LIRS does across the country. So just wanted to start with a thank you. So Adam, I would say that it's a bit of a mixed bag, because on one hand, I think the public has come to really greatly appreciate the contributions of immigrants. But on the other hand, there have been questions that are raised about the future of immigration. And there's a couple of different ways that are kind of parsing out concerns. But I think it's important that as we're moving into the future that we be very clear-eyed about the challenges that we face. So first of all, in terms of the current workforce in the United States. So roughly speaking, I think about 16% of the workforce writ large is foreign-born. But let's look at occupations vital to the COVID-19 response, and what is the percentage of foreign-born workers in some of those occupations. So graders and sorters of agricultural products, over 60% of workers in that particular occupation are foreign-born. Packers and packagers who are doing things in essence with their hands, almost 50% of that occupation is staffed by the foreign-born. Ag workers, just miscellaneous, again, almost 50%. Food processing workers, nearly 40%. Home health aides, nearly 40%. Physicians, nearly 30%. Get down to pharmacists. Almost 25% of pharmacists are foreign-born. Nursing assistants, also again, almost 25%. So in these occupations that are vital to the nation's response and recovery to COVID-19, the data makes it very clear that immigrants are playing a disproportionate role in helping the country move forward. Now, the promising thing is that the public is seeing that, and the American public is realizing that without the contributions of immigrants in these vital occupations, we would be in an even worse position than we are now. So, I'll just run through a few numbers from recent polls. In April of this year, there's an Ipsos poll that found that 40% agreed that the government should provide aid to undocumented immigrants who could not work due to layoffs and illness. 40% disagreed. But then a month later, the Pew Research Center released results which found that more than 2/3 of respondents said they thought that the government should provide health care for undocumented immigrants who contracted COVID-19. Those are two very good numbers in terms of the public understanding what the contributions, but also the challenges that are being faced by the immigrant community. On the other hand, this same poll by Ipsos in April 2020, 79% of respondents agreed that immigration from all other countries should be temporarily stopped. And Karen got to this a little bit in terms of, yes, we do need to have practical measures in place to protect the health of the country. My concern is that when does a temporary pause become in the worst case scenario, a permanent pause, or even a continued contraction of legal immigration into the future? Let me fast forward to another Ipsos poll that was released in August, so a little more recent. In this poll, respondents said that they, again, supported a temporary closing of the border at the 78% level. They agreed that it was reasonable to prevent legal immigrants from bringing extended family members to the U.S. at a level of 60%. 58% of respondents believe that we should be banning the entry of guest workers and seasonal workers. And 58% believe that we should be banning the entry of asylum seekers and refugees. Those are really challenging numbers, and that begins to give us a sense of kind of what is the challenge moving forward. At the same time, in this poll, half of respondents said that they supported the federal government sending stimulus checks to undocumented immigrants who pay taxes. So that number is actually starting to inch up. So there is this, and for those of us who have kind of been in the immigration space for a long time, we're used to this kind of cognitive dissonance within the public's understanding of the value of immigrants and immigration. But within that dissonance, there is an opportunity because I do think, like I said at the beginning, people have come to understand what the contribution immigrants are today. Again, whether it's the agricultural, the food system, healthcare system, services overall. I think people have really internalized what those contributions are. But going back to what Karen was saying, we've seen over the last 4 years a continued effort to contract or decrease the number of legal immigrants to the United States, whether it's for work visa related work visas or family, or just like we saw late last night around the refugee resettlement ceiling for this coming fiscal year. So my fear here is that in the public's mind, they are beginning to internalize this idea that maybe the country doesn't need a sustainable and a stable flow of legal immigrants. But you start to kind of take a step back and you realize very quickly that if we as a nation continue on this trajectory to limit legal immigration, we're going to be paying an economic and a social cost that'll be quite expensive in the years and the generations ahead. We did some research back in 2015 that found, when we did it with the American Action Forum, which is a conservative think tank here in DC, and that by just after 20, the private sector would see a worker shortage of over 7 million. So, that number may have changed because of COVID-19, but the dynamics are by and large remaining the same. We're going to be coming out with a paper later this fall that's going to be looking actually at the demographic change of the country and looking at the legal immigration needs of the United States vis-a-vis the aging of our population. And, to kind of give you a bit of a spoiler alert, we're going to be making the case that as the United States continues to age, and the workforce across occupations continues to decrease, we're actually going to need to start to incrementally increase legal immigration to the U.S. So my point here is that, whether it's from an economic perspective, a social perspective, or even from a national security perspective, we need to be thinking about the value of immigrants and immigration as a benefit to the United States in terms of creation of jobs, provision of services, from a law enforcement perspective in terms of serving and protecting, whether it's in a community like Salt Lake City, or serving and protecting the United States in a nation such as Afghanistan as a member of our armed services. In many states and localities, in fact, a legal permanent resident can join the Army and defend the United States overseas, but cannot come back to their community and serve and protect their community as a local police officer. And then finally, from a cultural perspective, and we do a lot of work in the faith community, the opportunity way that the country is changing in terms of rural areas and suburban areas, all of those changes are taking place in schools, in churches, in community organizations where communities are really starting to get to know each other, and kind of irrespective of our very kind of divisive national politics, it's in these organizations at a local level where the friendships and the relationships are being generated that, we hope that over time will change the political tenor of the nation's immigration debate. So to end where I started, I think there's a lot of positive things to see in terms of how the public is understanding the contribution of immigrants. We have to be very clear-eyed about the challenges that we face in the future.
Thank you, Ali, and I appreciate your sketching there a lot of the ranges of domestic impact and opportunity that immigration brings, and the impact, frankly, the risk of policies under the Trump administration have to perpetuate some challenges there. Krish, I wanted to add here yet another layer to the discussion, and that is looking outward and also making the connection to our national security. And we all woke up this morning at the beginning of the new federal fiscal year to the news that the administration is going to propose a new low of resettled refugees at just 15,000, far, far below the average 95,000 goal that has been since the beginning of the program 40 years ago. In addition, earlier this week, we had a quote from a former Trump administration Homeland Security Counterterrorism Assistant Secretary who was quoted as saying the reduction is really not based on security, but driven by impetus to keep people out. From your positions at LARS and also State Department in particular, I mean, how does these moves and all of the policy changes we've heard, how do these impact the U.S.'s ability to lead globally, and how do you see the impact to our national security?
Thanks, Adam, for the question. Thanks for hosting this event, and really wonderful to be here with amazing colleagues who are helping fight the good fight in what has felt for a few years now like this war on immigration and immigrants. So just to contextualize it, and as Karen and Ali have eloquently laid out, we really are at an abysmally low point when it comes to immigration. The massive, seemingly endless policy changes are more than a nightmare for immigrants and their families. And for our economies and communities, what they are is an abdication of global leadership and truly an active threat to our national security. And so it's really appreciated the opportunity to talk about this issue in that context. Security and refugees is obviously a hot topic. All you have to do is turn on the news and you hear those two terms put together. There is a pervasive, destructive myth out there that immigrants pose a threat to national security. Anti-immigration pundits posit that criminals are trying to slip through our borders, that immigrants commit crimes, that they're drug dealers, rapists, and it's not just pundits. It's also our current president. So some of you may recall that Trump's comments at a recent rally describing Somali Americans as radical Islamic terrorists. It's absurd. It's offensive, and let's call it what it is. It's a lie. As we well know at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service through our work, refugees and immigrants go through an intense vetting process. Background checks, Karen alluded to this as well, security checks, fingerprinting, health screening, in-person interviews with DHS. It's incredibly rigorous. And it's been proven time and time again that natural-born citizens commit crimes at much higher rates than immigrants. In fact, higher rates of immigration are actually associated with lower overall crime rates. Immigrants, in fact, contribute exponentially to our economy and our society, making America safer. And so restricting immigration does not, particularly when it comes to issues of foreign policy and national security, aid America, in this claim of self-interest. Beyond that, of course, immigration, it's an ethical and moral imperative, but it's also a vital tool for diplomacy. Our global refugee crisis today, it's unprecedented. At this moment, there are more than 69 million people displaced from their homes, forced to flee due to war and persecution. And this administration's announcement, just released last night, and so appreciate this timely conversation, is proposing to lower our refugee ceiling to just 15,000 for the fiscal year 2021, the lowest in the history of the US refugee admissions program. Last year, the ceiling was just 18,000, and we didn't even meet that. We're settling only 11,814 refugees. All this while constant policy changes, essentially aim to end asylum at our southern border. And so we are in effect showing that the United States is no longer a humanitarian leader and that we don't care about anyone beyond our borders. And so the question is, what kind of example does that set? If we are demonstrating total disregard for the most vulnerable worldwide, why would any other countries trust us? Other countries are bearing the brunt of global displacement. We're not even in the top 10. We've abdicated that leadership and complicated our domestic and our diplomatic relationships. We no longer set the model for humanitarian action on the global stage, which has a disastrous domino effect in decreasing humanitarian action. And that's not to mention the effect of essential decimation of immigration that has in the eyes of our allies. I can't imagine, what we look like to Turkey, which has been embroiled in active conflict for decades, and yet it still harbors the most refugees of any country in the world. But the disintegration of immigration in the United States is not just damaging for our international reputation and relationships. We know that immigrants make our economy stronger and our society more culturally rich, but we also have to think about the U.S.'s reputation and the toll it's taking in terms of would-be new Americans, because our new visa restrictions are affecting our ability to attract and recruit international talent. And even if these restrictions were not in place, the U.S. has anything but a pristine reputation for its treatment of foreign-born students and workers. And so limiting immigration directly limits innovation, and we're bound to suffer for it. The Niskanen Center put it succinctly in a 2018 article on this very topic, where they said, officials and experts have explained that resettling refugees advances U.S. strategic interests in 4 major areas. It aids in the recruitment of intelligence assets abroad, increases U.S. global influence, undermines anti-Western propaganda, and helps promote stability in foreign countries. Writer Matthew Iglesias actually offers another interesting perspective in his new book titled 1 Billion Americans. He suggests that the United States can't afford to decrease immigration because more citizens equals more power on the international stage. Now, I know that may sound like I'm commodifying this issue, but there is a part of his argument that rings true, because we need immigrants and their contributions to keep our country strong. And, I'll try to summarize, my final point, which is that this applies to our military too. So under these constant immigration policy changes, our national security takes a direct, concrete hit, because immigrants account for a significant portion of our military strength. There are 2.4 million veterans of immigrant origin, either because they themselves are immigrants or they are the children of immigrants. And that accounts for 13% of all veterans. And they continue to serve. About 8,000 non-citizen immigrants enlist in our military each year. And so in a 2006 hearing on the contributions of immigrants to the military, Senator John McCain pointed out that, immigrants actually represent a critical part of our national security. And so, this is where I think it's really important for us to understand the implications of what the administration has done. Because, when we have these kinds of issues, what McCain said, what I think is a really salient point. He said, if we do not provide the same opportunities for future immigrants that we provided for our forefathers, it is an affront to our national ideals. We owe these servicemen more for the sacrifices they have made for this country. And so, our service to our nation no longer offers a guarantee of naturalization. In 2019, naturalization rates fell a staggering 43% from the previous year. That is also applied to special immigrant visas. For those of you who may not know, SIVs, these are issued to Iraqi and Afghan nationals who assisted the U.S. military and put their lives in risk. So in FY20, the U.S. had the opportunity to welcome 13,000 SIVs. We only welcomed 9,630. It's not bad, but it's just not where we need to be. So I'll end with the words of General Mattis, who in 2019 wrote a memo advocating against further cuts. And he said, "The failure to honor our commitment to those who have supported the U.S. would undermine our diplomatic and military efforts by making it more difficult to sustain the support of partners elsewhere." So let me just end with this question. If the United States cannot support those who have given us so much socially, economically, culturally, and for some risking their lives and the health and safety of themselves and their families, how can we expect anyone to support the US from a national security perspective?
Thank you very much for the powerful set of comments, Krish, there. Ali, I wanted to go back to you to pick up, I think, on this question of impact and security and identity and who we are aspiring to be as Americans. You've had some recent writings, some very compelling writings where you're using the themes of pandemics have villains and the need for heroes and crossing and seeking to cross a threshold. I'd be curious if you could unpack a little bit what you're meaning and thinking about in terms of these, using these terms in the present context.
Okay. So a lot of what I've been thinking, so there's a new book out called A Mighty and Irresistible Tide, and it's written by Jia-Lin Yang. And, it is easily, from my perspective, kind of one of the best immigration books out there, because she looks at this period of time between the 1920s and 1965. But she doesn't get into the policy details and all of kind of the legalese. What she does is looks at kind of the key players over time, and then the context, the political context within which those players operated. And when you look at American history between the 1920s and 1965, you have the establishment of racial quotas in the immigration system. You have the United States saying to Jewish refugees fleeing Nazis, "No, you can't come in." You have moments where the country is moving aggressively in the direction of eugenics. You see, the civil rights movement emerge and just finally gets to the Civil Rights Acts of 1965. But in these 50 years, so many very scary things happen, but also so many kind of inspirational things happen. So what I've been trying to think about is, who are the heroes of today that help us kind of get past the threshold that we face now? Because, a lot of people these days will say, well, things are terrible. A friend of mine wrote, we've crossed a threshold and, our best days are behind us. Well, I cannot believe that, the United States' best days were the days when we were having an active debate about eugenics and racism. I have to believe that our best days are still in front of us. So my point here is that, and we see this quite a bit in our organizing work, conservatives and moderates, and, again, across faith, law enforcement, businesses, how do you tap into someone's aspirational identity? How do you have a conversation, whether it's directly or through a broader communication strategy, that helps someone who has questions and concerns about immigration, but help them, kind of get closer to who they aspire to be, whether it's as a conservative person of faith, a law and order voter, someone who believes in the free market. And I think that so much of our problem right now kind of is that we've been dragged into this very deeply polarized debate, and we don't give ourselves the time and the opportunity to think about what do other people who have questions and concern about immigration, what do they aspire to be what do they aspire in terms of the country for their kids. And I think if we were to approach our advocacy that way and approach our communications that way, we could over time really begin to expand the coalition and ensure that really our best days as a country are ahead of us.
Thank you for sharing that. Krish, I wanted to come back to you and picking up actually an audience question here on specifically the refugee cap, and recognizing that it's Vice President Biden has proposed a cap of 125, and wanting to see how the partners could be ready to deliver on that. And I think, adding to that, Ali's observations, what is the social impact on growing this program? And how do we think differently about meeting that need where people are in the communities where they live?
Yeah, so I said the last several years have been a roller coaster ride when you think about the refugee resettlement space in particular. But it'll be interesting to see kind of where we can go and how we get there, if in fact we, have a change in administration. Part of what we have noticed in the last year is there was an unintended consequence of the president's executive order that he issued last year. So the president published an executive order requiring governors and local leaders to explicitly declare a willingness to accept refugees. And what's interesting is that we actually had 42 governors from Republican and Democratic states explicitly publish this affirmation. We had over 109, local leaders. And I think that speaks to the fact that when you actually take this out of partisan politics and, many of these communities came together and debated, you actually had a current, popular declaration that refugee resettlement, whether it's a matter of faith, whether it's a matter of economic interest, whether it's a matter of who America has, been as a nation, that communities have recognized the value. So the question is, if we actually do have a presidential determination of 125,000, we can actually harness this community support because we have programs called community co-sponsorship, where refugee resettlement agencies like mine work with the community to actually support a refugee family that is located in their community. And so, I can't say because there are a number of systems issues that have developed over the last few years because of what has felt like death by 1,000 cuts, that we'll get to 125,000 in the first year of a new administration, because we're going to need to build the pipeline abroad, but also build the capacity here at home. But I can tell you that we're going to get to at least triple, quadruple where we are now, because the capacity, the willingness, the enthusiasm is definitely there in the field.
Thank you, Christian. I think like you and Ali, I've been inspired by the conversations I've seen happen and the receptivity of Americans all around the country to be engaged and involved in immigration issues, in refugee resettlement. And Karen, I want to come to you on this because there's something that still striking about the manner in which this administration has approached these issues, and in particular, the orders of the past couple of months. I'm quoting here some language from a recent complaint that your organization filed. The proclamation is in part a series of measures intended to achieve the goal of substantially shutting down congressionally authorized immigration to the United States. All of this is unlawful. Congress has already considered and rejected the immigration cuts the president seeks to implement unilaterally through the proclamation, unilaterally rewriting federal immigration laws. So the manner in which this is conducted is not a community conversation, right? This is not an engaging of where people are. It's something very different, and it threatens, I think, the bounds of what presidential authority is or ought to be. So I'm curious how you think about the fight it is on multiple levels and how more of the American public's view can be brought to bear when there's an administration that's out of whack.
That's such an important question, Adam, and also the discussion has been so enriching. I would say, speaking directly to what you were quoting, it is shocking to me how much over the last years the president has done through, presidential fiat or executive pen that is in direct conflict with carefully considered and frankly really hard to pass congressional legislation on immigration. And those pieces of legislation are hard to pass, in fact, because of the things that Ali and Krish have been talking about, right? Because to get something through both houses of Congress and signed by the president, you have to grapple with these questions of Who are we? Who do we aspire to be? What do we want the U.S. role in the world to be viewed as? And to consider a combination of economic factors, family unification factors, humanitarian assistance, and how we cooperate in matters of national security internationally. And so then to have the president come in and to start with what people thought was small, right? Oh, my family's not from the listed Muslim banned family, so maybe I don't have to pay attention to it. And then that same authority gets used to expand, and then there's a refugee ban. And then there is this, and before he did the massive legal immigration ban, there was a small ban on people who couldn't show that they could pay out of pocket for certain junk health insurance programs. And then we got the monster of the immigration ban and its impact. And as Krish was saying, even if we change administrations, the ability to undo this is going to take years and years and years because of the shutout effect and the way our systems have changed. One thing I want to pull up, and I think, Ali said so wisely, we get dragged into this deeply polarized debate about immigration. And it is important to balance the ideas of what do we want our system to promote, what values. But what I want to remind people is that the scope of the changes we've seen from this president touch all of us at the individual level because they've gone so broad. So let me just take off a few for you quickly. So I've had the honor of being part of the DACA litigation for many years, and sadly, even after the Supreme Court victory, which is a real watershed moment for the immigrants' rights movement to have a victory of that magnitude at the Supreme Court, we're fighting again because the president has tried to change it. Almost everyone who's listening to this probably knows a DACA recipient personally. And so we can all kind of calibrate, for me, for example, one of my son's teachers in elementary school is a DACA recipient. And it was very challenging while the litigation was happening and knowing she was teaching my son's class. And she wanted to know, will I still have a job? Will I be safe? And even if you don't know a DACA recipient, some of you are like me with this legal immigration ban. The other category of family-based immigrants who were cut out is siblings. So my mom is an immigrant from Canada, married my dad, who's a U.S. citizen. She's a U.S. citizen now, and an immigrant voter. But, very early on when we were born, her sister came. And she was like the other mother to me. She always lived, within walking distance of our house. And the president has decided to overwrite the congressional design that those family members matter. And so many of us can relate to, wait a minute, my aunties or uncles couldn't come. And even if none of that applies to you, you may be, or you like one of my clients who owns a robust landscaping business in Michigan. And for years, has gone through the rigorous process of proving that there are no U.S. workers who would take certain seasonal jobs in the snow doing landscaping in Michigan, and is a job producer, right? Because for a decade has been able to bring in temporary workers who come in, do the work, produces continuous jobs for U.S. citizens around this business, which is at risk of bankruptcy and collapse due to the latest ban. And so what I want to say is the magnitude of the changes that we are left with will touch us all, but it may be in different ways. And that goes back to me to the identity question, which is, you may not know of certain changes, but the scale of its impact on your workplaces and your families and your communities is significant. And I think sometimes in this deeply polarizing debate, we forget to bring it back to that level.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Karen. And just a note also to the audience, as we are approaching the last 25 minutes or so, if you want to be adding your own questions to the discussion, please use the function at the bottom of your screen and we'll be reviewing some of those. Ali and Krish, I want to pick up on Karen's point and put maybe a broader question to either or both of you. But it really is this. So the lasting impact of some of these changes is not only the undoing of regulation. I mean, some of the bans, some of the executive orders could be theoretically easy, right? But some of the regulatory processes much harder. But actually, I'm concerned too about the change in behavior. And after the years of message that has been received, and now layering, for example, the proposed rulemaking around student visas and limiting their access to 2 years for up to 59 countries and making it harder to renew, just the collective message that this sends to an intending immigrant, to a student who's trying to come to the United States, and that those change behaviors and patterns could really outlast any of this policy. Be curious to have your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's lessons that in the resettlement community, working with unaccompanied children, that we have learned I hate to call it complacency, but when you take the refugee resettlement program, a bipartisan program, Reagan resettled the highest number of refugees of any president. You had more refugees resettled under Republican administrations than Democratic administrations. And I think part of the strategy was that this was an accepted program that frankly didn't need to have public support, that it was perhaps better to have it kind of fly under the radar. And I think that this has been a real kind of awakening in terms of we need to build a base. And I think, related to Karen's, comments just now, part of that base can't be just on your unique issue, right? It can't be that we create this dynamic of zero sum where it's either we open up the southern border or we accept refugees. Even in the language communicated by the administration yesterday, the assumption underlying it was that it was zero sum. And America has always been able to, walk and chew gum. And so I think that is one lesson we have learned, that we need to lay a more affirmative, proactive narrative around immigration, because the xenophobia, the white nationalist language you're seeing, it doesn't end with this administration, even if the president doesn't get reelected. So I think that is one really critical lesson we've learned. We've also learned that it's really, yes, of course, it's important to talk about America's legacy as a nation, and the humanitarian and the moral imperative. But we've certainly learned in the last few years that the messengers matter. And so when we're able to put a business leader explaining the value of the immigrant population to a community, that helps. When we're able to put a bishop or a reverend out there explaining how for many Americans this is a matter of faith, it sometimes resonates when our pleas fall on deaf ears. And so I think that's where, for us, the last few years has been incredibly educational. And I hope that coming out of this, we don't forget those lessons.
Ali, I'd love to on that. Oh, please go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to ask you to pick up on that and also add an additional public opinion note that I don't believe you mentioned, which is a recent Pew Research survey that shows that eligible voters, and this is a question they've been asking for a very long time, do immigrants, are they more of a strength or a burden to the country, actually went up to record numbers in the last 4 years. In just 4 years, went from 46% saying strengthen up to 60%, and that is all voters. And that went up among shares of Republicans as well as Democrats. So putting that together with some of Krish's comments, I'd love to hear your response.
It's so there's I was last fall, I was speaking at the Texas Public Policy Foundation conference, and it's a very conservative organization, obviously out of Texas. And this is the first time at their policy conference they had a couple of panels on immigration. The first panel was on border, and it was like a packed room, right? And people were just very, very upset. Then the panel that I was on, it was moderated by a former congressman, and Mark Krikorian was on the panel as well. He's one of the kind of the leading anti-immigrant organizations. And he kind of went down his usual path of, for us to be pro-immigrant, we're just giving the country over to the United Nations, open borders, blah, 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 blah. And I've heard that shtick before. And I'm watching people's heads in the audience. And everybody's kind of laughing at his one-liners and kind of getting a kick out of it. And I kind of took a gamble. And when it was my turn to speak, I said, you know what? We all laugh at Mark Krikorian. He's makes us, his are funny. But he's also insulting all of us. And the point that I made to the room was that when our opponents are oversimplifying the immigration debate and saying, close the border, no more immigration, mass deportation, it caters to a segment of the American population. But there are more people than I think we realize that see immigration as a complicated challenge, and they're ready to have a complicated conversation to come up with a very nuanced solution. So again, in this room that was 80% against our position at the forum, as soon as I was able to say, as soon as I was able to acknowledge the complexity of the challenge and to more or less tap into all of our aspirations to be smart, intelligent people, to have complicated conversations, they all started saying, okay, yeah, so what's the complicated solution? And you know what the best part about that panel is that Mark Krikorian never responded to my point. And I kept saying it over and over again. I'm not sure, Karen, if you ever, but it's like, when he feels like he has the upper hand, he'll keep responding. But when he doesn't want to talk about it, he just won't even go there. So my point here, and kind of pick up on what Chris is saying and what you're saying, Adam, is that yes, messenger is important. Yes, public opinion in some polls is trending our way. But I don't think that should give us any reason to believe that there's a simple solution ahead. Because on the other side of COVID-19, tens of millions of Americans are going to remain without a job. And I guarantee you, our opponents who right now are thrilled that the stock market is going up and would much rather have the American public forget about COVID-19, if our opponents are out of power, that is all they're going to talk about. So I think we have to anticipate the way that, the jujitsu that we're going to have to deal with in, hopefully, in a different context in the years ahead. And I just don't think we should assume that the numbers and the trends that we're seeing now are going to see us through on the other side of this. And we just have to be really thinking about what is the nuanced and complicated conversation we need to have with the public.
Mm-hmm. And coming back to the kind of tactics and the manner, I want to put to Karen another layer here as well. We now have reports that ICE is planning a show of force, right, kind of before the election, and kind of the use and abuse of federal authorities that are ostensibly immigration authorities, but really being used in ways that is intended to go far beyond. So I'd like to hear you weigh in on those matters as well, and if you could also share, knowing that there's a lot of actions that have been overstepping norms, if not legal bounds. The Supreme Court is obviously a hot topic. What do you see coming to a next court now that RBG is no longer there?
RBG, one of my sheroes. Great questions, Adam, as always. So on tactics and manner first, and then the High Court. So on tactics and manner, I think, obviously, I cannot countenance the notion that as we enter the final month before an election, that immigrants and what matters most to them, whether they can stay in this country or not, would be used as a riling up the base electoral issue, right? I want immigration enforcement that is smart, that is considered and thoughtful, not that is designed as a show of force, as you're saying. And certainly, what I would say about that, connecting it to what we've seen from President Trump, is that there are no tactics that are below the belt for this president when it comes to immigrants, unfortunately. And, I will give you two examples, and then what I think is the why. So we all were aware, right, of what happened in family separation in 2018, and there was a massive and bipartisan outcry against that as too far and absolutely below the belt. We don't rip children, including small children, from their parents as a show of force, as a deterrent mechanism. We use other mechanisms that don't long-term traumatize and torture families. But what people have forgotten is that family separation is continuing today. So no tactic is below the belt. We have brought lawsuits to stop this administration from orphaning children as young as 6 years old because their parents are here in the country, but they've decided that they can remove these kids from the parental care to a country where they have no parents and no adults who would take them in. It's mind-blowing to me that these are battles that we have to fight, and we have to fight them at the individual level, which is beyond the capacity of advocates to respond. But that's a tactic. I want to be clear. It's a tactic that is continued, that the administration has acknowledged that they believe if they separate families, it will change the inflow of humanitarian asylum seekers, which, I quibble with, but there has to be questions of how far are we willing to go in the same way we ask ourselves. And again, I'm not trying to use hyperbolic language, but when you talk about separating children from any caregiver, it is, I believe, under any definition, torture. So similarly, in the national security sphere, how far will we go in terms of what are we willing to use that is tantamount to torture? We have to ask that in the immigration sphere. And then you asked about the High Court, which is really, it's a hard subject. But this is how I feel as somebody whose value add is by engaging in the back and forth in the courtroom around our policies and the scope of rights for immigrants. It changes everything, of course, if the president's nominee is confirmed in the waning days of his presidency in a way that is absolutely historical, in a way that we don't have to look far back, was not allowed for President Obama on a much longer scope. But long term, I believe that even with a 6-3 court, changes in progress will continue to be made in the courtroom for immigrants because those changes are never just about the judges who are sitting in the chairs and wearing the black robes. It is, in fact, my belief, long term, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's belief that our real change comes when the court is catching up to public opinion. And so I look back at what you said, Adam, the change in those Pew poll numbers. So if I have a 6-3 court, if I have a 5-4 court, I don't care. We're going to move forward, trying to do what Krish said, which is building a base of support for the values we hold dear on immigration. That is not one issue. That doesn't pit one set of immigrants against each other. And, I think that the late Justice Thurgood Marshall, when he was bringing cases for justice for Black Americans, faced much more hostile courts. We'll do the same.
It's a quick follow-up. Do you have any cases now, or are there cases you're watching that you think are headed to the court in the immigration space?
Oh, yes. Sadly, yes. I think that the case you quoted from, Adam, is destined for the Supreme Court because it's so broad and it's the ultimate test of presidential authority under the specific statute that he's using. I mean, if the president is reelected, pardon me?
Oh, sorry, this is the June proclamation. I just was stating for the record.
The June proclamation, I think, is headed to the Supreme Court if President Trump has a second term. In addition, I think regardless of who the next president is, I think DACA will be headed back to the Supreme Court. And the reason is there's still a challenge brought by Texas and other states to the legality of DACA. And so I think that we have a long-term fight, whether we're in a Biden administration or a Trump 2 administration, around the scope of executive authority for programs like DACA.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, we've seen just recently to the ruling on the fee rule, the immigration benefits fee rule from USCIS, partially predicated on the fact that the acting assistant secretary is not lawfully appointed. So we're going down several rabbit holes with that. Going back, I think we've talked a good bit on identity impact and kind of the range of kind of issues with which the American public are grappling and of multiple minds. Are there clearer policy solutions? I mean, so were there to be this broader majority of support that translated to a policymaking ability, let's say, are there easy answers? Or to Ali, to start with you, to your point, is it in part hard because it is complicated and people tune out and there aren't easy answers to fix the policy problems that are there?
Well, I think in the years ahead, let's think about whether it's this 2021 or the next administration after a second Trump term. How do we reimagine not just the immigration system, but actually how to advance immigration solutions? So there are a couple pieces of legislation that we worked on over the course of this current Congress that I think could be a template in terms of how to move forward. So one was the Kerry-Orozco Act, and this act would, if I remember correctly, would grant expedited citizenship to the immigrant family members of first responders killed in the line of duty. Now, we were able to, get the support of Republican members of Congress who would never touch an immigration bill. They just, you say immigration to some of these members, are like, they're gone, right? They're just turn around and run. But in the context of a first responders bill, it was a conversation they were willing to have. So, how do we find more opportunities like that to just start to begin this conversation with a member of Congress or their constituents of, okay, this is what immigration looks like in this context, and this is the value that it adds to your very specific community. That's one example. The other was the Healthcare Modernization Act. And this was by and large a function of kind of the national response to COVID-19. But the idea was to, with this particular piece of legislation, to make an effort to expand visa opportunities, legal work visa opportunities for parts of the healthcare workforce. Again, it wasn't necessarily framed explicitly as an immigration bill as much as it was a healthcare workforce piece of legislation. And I just think that, regardless of the outcome of this coming election or the elections ahead, we've got to be much more nimble of the way we're talking about these issues, the way that we are creating and taking advantage of legislative opportunities. And just to bring it back through to the membership and the audience of the Truman Center, I really strongly believe that the national security component of these questions is going to become more and more important. I think that on the other side of COVID, we're going to see an increased amount of pressure on our border, on borders around the world. So from a national security perspective, what are the policies, who are the spokespeople that can really clearly lay out why it's important for the U.S. to have a constructive approach to refugee resettlement, immigration, the immigrants who are here already. And, it's just, I'm really, really, urging folks, who are watching this to kind of think in their own spheres about how their leadership within the national security community can be brought to bear on this issue.
I'd like to bring you in on this too, Chris, and starting with the observation. So at this conference tomorrow, Truman will be honoring Alexander Vindman for moral courage, himself a resettled refugee from Ukraine. Obviously, the story of his service in the White House is now legendary. But would love to hear your reaction to that idea of service, national security, and also the what are the paths forward on policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I started my comments highlighting, we do need to start understanding that immigration is a core part of our national security, whether it is how we ensure that we have the translators, interpreters, drivers that we need while the military is deployed abroad, whether it's enlisting soldiers that we need into our military forces here at home, but also just broader issues where, when I ran Let Girls Learn at the White House, we knew that educating girls in refugee camps was a matter of national security because it was a strategy of countering violent extremism. And so just to add on to Ali's comments in terms of where I think there are some policy opportunities in the future, I do think that there are a couple issues that, whether we like it or not, we're going to have to tackle. One is climate displacement. So we know that 2/3 of the migrants that we deal with today are as a result of the climate crisis. And so recognizing that as a reality is really going to come to a head. No country in the nation actually has a path for resettlement for climate refugees or climate displaced persons. Even the terminology is disputed, even though about 22.5 million people per year have been displaced in the last 10 years. This is not saying, oh, this is a projection for 2050. This is the reality we face at home, but it's also an issue that America faces when we talk about Native Americans who are, inhabiting the Ile de Jean Charles off the coast of Louisiana. We have American citizens who are getting federal taxpayer dollars to resettle because of sea level rise. And so this is an issue that I do think American policymakers are going to have to take on. And then the other issue I'll highlight is an underlying dynamic of what we see as the immigration system here at home is the militarization, or basically the putting brown and black persons in jail, oftentimes because there's a profit incentive. So when you look at the private prison companies who thankfully were pushed out of the domestic prison system, as a product of criminal justice reform, they look to immigration as their new profit center. And so when you look at the fact that, the vast majority of detainees in the immigration system sit in immigration detention centers run by for-profits, that, GEO, Core Civic, literally have made billions of dollars, just 1.8 billion of ICE contracts just in the past year, you realize that ending the kind of system we have today is ending the profiteering off of immigration. And so that is a dynamic, again, that I think there's a real opportunity if there is a new administration.
To unpack that further, is there opportunity in the necessary delayed awareness of and reckoning, frankly, of Black Lives Matter and the racial justice inequity that we've endured as a country for far, far too long, to really make policy changes in coalitions that are stronger today as a result of this awareness and meeting common cause in some of these areas like private prisons and otherwise that can really have a different justice outcome for so many more of our Americans and aspiring Americans?
It's a great question. So I'll follow up, but obviously I hope my colleagues will jump in. I'd say there is a huge opportunity in two ways. So one is just the fact that if we can frame this issue as not Democrats versus Republicans, but one of industry versus a reasonable policy of how we actually want to use taxpayer dollars, when you hear these arguments of, we can't fund this, that, or the other because we don't have the money to pay for it. When you look at the fact that, we've given these two companies alone $5.4 billion in the last few years, there's plenty of money. Now, of course, the fact that, you take GEO and their CEO gave the Republican Party $500,000, it suggests that maybe that will be a difficult argument to cast because of, just campaign finance. But I do think there's an opportunity. The other piece of this is when you look at the crackdown and the deployment of CBP and maybe even some ICE officials to Portland, Oregon, to crack down on racial justice protests. This is the spillover effect, right? For experts like us in the immigration space, we have seen the abuse of enforcement officers on the southern border. This is just a matter of them being redeployed inland. And so this is where I hope that we can continue to join forces in solidarity, because I do think these issues share a real commonality in humanity.
We have just a couple minutes left, but I'd love to get Ali, you and Karen in on this point too.
I can start. I do apologize that you might hear a truck going by. This is our times of COVID. I totally agree with what Chris said. I think there's real opportunity and, in fact, an imperative for us to connect the dots between the struggle for racial justice, particularly for Black Americans, and what we're doing on immigration. I'll give one example as the truck passes by, which is, and it's somber, right? I have the privilege of working as part of a legal team that is responding and assisting some of the women who are subject to horrific medical abuses in a Georgia detention center, including some that were as severe as forced sterilization without their consent. And I say that in pause because you would think that I'm talking about something in our history. You would think that I'm talking, for example, about Tuskegee. And you would think that I was talking specifically, and again, I'm being really candid because I think it's important, about our shameful history of infecting Black Americans with disease in order to use them as guinea pigs. You would think that. But I'm not. I'm talking about something that has happened now. I'm talking about something that this week you saw the release of medical records confirmed by independent doctors in a New York Times story. And the reason is, again, I'm going back to what Chris just said. On our watch, under recent years, we have allowed the private prison system and the immigration detention system to blossom and grow. And that system treats people in a way that no human should be treated. This is the result. And so we have to do more. It's what Chris said before. We can't be single issue. We can't say, my issue is immigration as it relates to national security. We have to look at these intersections. And it really is a call for the immigration community to say, if we are going to work on what's happening to these women, which in some cases is forced sterilization, we need to do our work and connect to our Black brothers and sisters who have been doing this for decades.
Thank you, Karen. Ali, you have 15 seconds if you have a quick comment on this.
So I would just say, I think we have to kind of keep in mind the country that we want to be a part of, the country that we want our children or grandchildren to be a part of. And again, like I said earlier, in our communications, in our advocacy, really try to build that coalition so that people can begin to reach those aspirations. So that's my 15 seconds. Thank you.